So you got a gist of the boy's argument. He's not really got a clue at all about that of the economic calculation problem, and of course history contradicts him. Let's move on with his argument.
Simply put, the supposed efficiency and quote-unquote rationality of the market is little more than a meme, and a bad one at that, especially when it's all built on a lie, since you have Chapter 3, Planning under Capitalism. Why yes, planning, as expansive, if not even more expansive than ever occurred under the USSR, takes place every single day in practically every firm under capitalism.
There is a colossal difference between that of planning under capitalism to that of central planning of an economy under socialism. The economic central planning under socialism is going to destroy the information of profits and losses. The central planner is going to be left with guesswork. It doesn't know how much to produce, what resources to use, where to allocate the resources, what to produce and stop producing, what to invest and stop investing in, and how the resources are transported. None of that information is available because of the economic calculation problem. They don't hold the information of profits and losses. That's the issue. It's not driven by consumer demand. Planning under capitalism, a business will plan obviously in terms of production, but it will base that off of consumer demand itself. So it's consumer demand that's driving production. The consumers are the ones telling businesses what sells and what doesn't, telling businesses here's what we want and here's what we don't want, because after all, when consumers go into companies and they buy the goods that they want, that's consumers pretty much conveying to the producers, this is what we want you to produce more of. And if you don't produce more of that, then of course your company's just going to face losses. There's no benefit to a company just producing whatever the hell it likes, facing a risk, putting out their products on the shelves that are not going to sell, and that's not beneficial to the company. It's going to cost them in terms of resource usage. If the company's not going to sell goods, then of course that's a serious issue because they're going to face losses. In economic reality, it's what the consumer's willing to pay for stuff. So it's the consumer that's the one dictating what prices are and dictating whether goods sell or not. So in a capitalist system, planning is based off consumer demand, and what he doesn't touch upon is that in companies you do have market research departments. Those market research departments exist for a good reason. And the reason why they exist, the company can then analyse what their consumers want and don't want, and they can also look at their competitors to see what they're doing, and therefore it keeps them in competition, and they're going to provide for what consumers are in demand of. So the truth is, capitalism is not pro-business. Capitalism is pro-consumer, and that's one of the biggest myths about capitalism, and you're pretty much hearing that from this perspective. The consumer's the one driving what prices are. The consumer's the one dictating what gets produced and what doesn't. The consumer therefore is the one dictating where resources are going to go and where they don't go. So that's the difference between capitalism with planning with regards to that of the economic central planning done by government, where the government destroys the information of profits and losses.
Of course, in between firms, companies operate on a market, but internally there is no market. Strange, as the market purists want you, and imperial perfect countries they extend criminal loans to believe that markets are the solution to everything, at every time, everywhere.
Well, it's like he says about that of what's internal, and he completely ignores the external, which is to do with the consumers. He just bases this off the assumption, as if to say that businesses can simply produce whatever the hell they like, and that's more or less what he's saying. He's saying that businesses can just plan out production, plan out their business, do whatever the hell they like, and the consumer doesn't matter. As if to say that businesses can simply just set whatever price they like, put out goods there whatever the hell they like, and who cares about the consumer. But that isn't what profits are. Profits is, like I said, the information of what consumers are in demand of. How do we know that? Because those are the goods that are selling. When consumers walk into your store and they pick up the goods that they want, that's consumers telling you what they want, and that is the profits, because that's where your business is selling. That's the goods that are selling. That's where you're gaining profits from. Now, he ignores economic reality, that it's down to what consumers are willing to pay for something. You could, live in this imaginary fantasy world all you want, where you might think, oh well, businesses can set whatever prices they like. That isn't economic reality. Maybe you've got higher prices in certain businesses because businesses might target a certain niche, because not all niches are the same. A company might target a certain niche that's targeted towards those who are willing to pay for more expensive stuff. You might see that with certain clothing companies or whatever. If, however, businesses end up setting a price too high above consumers' demand, well, the economic reality is The consumer's not going to part with their money.
In reality, which sadly doesn't exist within those basic economics textbooks we're always told to consult, there is no internal market in large, well-functioning companies.
How the hell does he think businesses operate? Businesses have to operate with regards to serving for what consumers' needs and wants are. If you're not going to serve for your customers, you're not going to make any profits. It really is a very infantile view that these people have. And I really mean infantile. I mean so infantile, they honestly think that businesses can just do what they like. If it costs you more to use more resources, then businesses, of course, are not going to just produce whatever the hell they like, because they face the risk it's not going to sell, as I've explained. And of course, in relation to that, what if it costs you more to use more resources? What's a business going to do in order to maximise their profits? They're going to use fewer resources, aren't they? And they're obviously going to be more efficient. So in other words, to be more efficient, what does that mean? Providing for what consumers do want. I mean, common sense would tell you this, but common sense evades socialists, because socialists don't even have anything between the ears.
The different departments, stores, trucks, and suppliers do not compete against each other in a market. Everything is actually coordinated.
So I'm not entirely sure where he's going with this one, because suppliers are obviously part of the company, and companies are obviously in competition with one another. Another thing, of course, these delivery services, you know, whether it's Royal Mail or DPD or whatever, they're all in competition with one another. What's he talking about? That's just all part of the company. It's companies competing with other companies. I'm confused.
Walmart and Amazon are excellent examples of this phenomenon. These are no small economies either. Walmart's revenue is to the tune of around $500 billion, a little over half that of the USSR's GDP in the 70s. The comparison can't really be made accurately in this case, but it's just to give you an idea of the scale we're working with.
It's rather quite convenient that he talks about the Soviet Union with the high GDP. Not only was the Soviet Union being provided and financed by that of the West, forget that point however, it's the fact that what the Soviet Union was doing was producing waste. In other words, it was rancid with the economic calculation problem, just like that of the mass production of the more than 3 pairs of shoes. And of course there was the massive big long waiting lines in the late 1980s in the Soviet Union because the shoes that they produced did not meet the taste of the consumer. Likewise, it was the same with the pelts that were left to rot in warehouses. He's going on about this to do with Walmart and Amazon. Again, Amazon as a company is serving for the customers. That's where their profits are. And he goes on about, of course, the net worth. Now, it's like I pointed out before, these people only look at the net worth. They don't understand what wealth is. They don't understand that wealth isn't the wages. Jeff Bezos, most of his wealth is held in the assets. An asset would be that of Amazon itself, the actual company. And the wealth that's been created is all the goods that are selling every single year. They completely ignore the wealth that has been created across millions, as millions have bought Amazon's products year in, year out. In other words, the money that, of course, Jeff Bezos is actually made of is much less than that.
But hold on. The knowledge problem of Mises, in which there are far too many calculations to make and far too many inputs and outputs to keep track of, doesn't seem to be affecting Walmart or Amazon in the slightest. Well, simply, that's because he was wrong, or more appropriately, was limited by the period in history he was writing in. The exact details would make this video longer than it already is, so I'll leave the appropriate book recommendations at the end of the video for those interested. But the complexity of Walmart versus an entire economy are two different things. Modern-day firms are islands of planning in a sea of market mechanisms, so you're still wrong, somehow. These grievances aren't particularly incorrect, just more misplaced. Walmart, Amazon, and dozens of other massive companies are at the forefront of developing both supply networks as well as algorithms and software for maximizing their efficiency towards their final end, profit. This is a fine experiment, both in theory and in practice, of the tools that socialism can use towards the ends of a humane and truly rational economic model.
So the problem with his argument is the fact that Amazon is a company that's operating off of profits and losses, right? So its consumer goods are obviously determined through that of what the consumer is dictating. And the consumer is telling such information through what they're buying most of and what they're least buying. In other words, what they're least buying is the losses, and what they are buying most of is the profits. And through price fluctuation, the market can tell through time preference, because obviously consumer demand isn't fixed. It changes persistently. Consumer demand is very complex, and you could never predict consumer demand. It changes all the time, and every single individual consumer is all different from one another. You know, a consumer might not want something now, but it might change their mind, you know, a week from now or 2 months from now, whatever. The point being is the fact that you cannot predict consumer demand. It's not something simplistic. Amazon knows because it can see from price fluctuation to determine whether goods are selling or not. Because when obviously there's a high demand for something, the price is obviously going to drive up. Therefore, they can tell from price signals, here is what we need to produce more of, because this is obviously what consumers are in demand of. Now, if you've got millions of other goods out there and millions of other prices out there, how are you going to keep track of all the thousands and thousands and thousands of different prices of all the goods, etc.? If you were to eliminate price fluctuation that is done through the laws of supply and demand, in other words through capitalism, then how do you know what consumers are in greater demand of something and not? You don't. The computer technology is gathering the information from the price signals. That's the entire reason his entire argument is collapsed in and on its arse. Because without the price signals, the information of these, computers, etc., wouldn't know the information. The price signals is obviously telling the businesses what to produce and stop producing, etc. That's done through price signals. That's the point that socialists don't understand. They think they can just get rid of the price signals, and as if by magic, somehow supercomputer technology is going to read the minds of millions of different consumers out there, and it's somehow going to know the information of consumers' needs and wants. But it's not. And even consumers' needs and wants is so vast, it's way above and beyond anything that supercomputer technology could ever begin to imagine. And I've even touched upon the milk distribution example before to show that when it comes to central planning by supercomputer technology, there's no way that it could calculate even 1 year's milk consumption and even plan production for something like that.
Ironically, this really does reflect Marx's words: what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. This isn't even mentioning the historic presence of planning in supposed capitalist success stories, such as South Korea and Japan.
Of course, on a question of scale, yes, in comparison to that of North Korea, then yes, South Korea is more capitalist. On a question of scale, that is. He hasn't provided an argument there. All he's mentioned is 2 names, South Korea and Japan. That's not an argument.
Planning is done all the time under capitalism. The only difference is, who's the planning done for? Chapter 4. Planning under socialism and supposed inefficiencies. Historically, planning was practiced in several countries. First and foremost amongst these is the USSR, the country that began as a backward land of peasants, devoid of industrial production, that within 3 decades became a modern nuclear superpower that conquered the cosmos.
Well, that's rather quite laughable, because the Soviet Union was getting 100% of its technology from the West. The West was financing the Soviet Union, and that's why the Soviet Union were driving about in Ford motors. I never knew Ford was a company that formed in the USSR. Oh, and by the way, folk, this global superpower they call it, what do they actually base that off of? He's not actually provided any argument to tell you why it was such a global superpower. A superpower on what exactly? Of being stagnant and falling way behind the rest of the world in terms of productivity? Now, when we talk about productivity, we're not talking about like Great Britain prior to Margaret Thatcher, where they produced a lot but produced substandard quality. Of course, they don't understand that. It's just like that with the Soviet Union. They think it's just a case, oh, look at the high GDP. That doesn't mean to say that you're actually productive in the economic efficient sense. It's just like how they were mass producing the pelts that was left to rot in warehouses. Much of that high GDP came right off the back of waste. Those are things that he doesn't touch upon. A global superpower, remember, of course, that led millions to starvation.
Now, this should go without saying, but modern planning will look very, very different than what it looked like in the USSR on account of our radically different conditions and levels of technology. For most of its existence, the USSR only planned a small group of inputs, around 10,000 out of an economy of over 10 million outputs.
And that's the problem, because you're never going to be able to solve the problem because you don't hold the information of profits and losses. That is price information signals. As soon as you eliminate the price information signals, that information is gone. There's no way for computer technology to read the human mind. And even if you mention about a surveillance system, kind of like the way that you see with advertising on Facebook, etc., where they're listening into you, watching what you're visiting, etc., then of course that is a socialist wet dream. They would have this wet dream of opening people's minds and tampering about with their brain, etc. The only way that you're ever going to gather such information is tampering about with someone's brain. Even from that technology that you see through the likes of Facebook, etc., even that scratches the surface. It doesn't even go past the surface. It's kind of like how you see the tip of an iceberg. Now that's with regards to consumers' needs and wants. It's far above and beyond anything those things could ever imagine. Consumers' demand isn't fixed, continuously changes. People continuously change their mind. That's the very reason why computer technology has no way of rationally working out people's needs and wants. It's impossible.
All of this in light of constant international vilification, sabotage both internal and external, military threat, diplomatic isolation, economic sanctioning, on and on. The very fact that they managed to achieve what they did with these constraints is nothing less than impressive. With that said though, the supposed inefficiency of planning, particularly Soviet planning, is the main criticism aimed at socialism even to this day. Some of the honest criticisms have their place, while a lot of them are kinda in the vein of shooting somebody in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk afterwards. Let's be fully clear. There were clear deficiencies of Soviet-era planning, some a result of their conditions, a lot more that they could have changed by their own hand, but didn't.
Again, what he's basically saying here is the fact that he's an economic illiterate degenerate that doesn't even understand the first thing to do with prices. That is to say, he doesn't understand price floors and price ceilings and what they cause. He seems to think that you can just eliminate prices and somehow you can just operate things efficiently. Again, that's what it really all boils down to, folk. He's never studied fundamental basic economics. He's just trying to say that, oh well, you know, he's making up excuses, so it's just something to do with the conditions, but it's nothing to do with the conditions. It's to do with the fact that the Soviet Union was economically centrally planning what the prices were, and the fact that you had 24 million different prices. Because of a price floor, that's what resulted in the surplus waste of the, pelts left to rot in warehouses. And just like, many examples you would see, the resource misallocation would take place because you don't have the information of market-driven prices. Market-driven prices is information of prices driven by consumer demand. Once you eliminate consumers driving what prices are, that's it, finished. You don't hold the information of consumers' needs and wants.
The claim goes that, due to the sheer scale of bureaucratic tasks involved with planning a major economy, inefficiencies occur and the market is a superior option. This is explored by Cockshott when he says,
"If there are hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of distinct products, no central planning authority could hope to keep track of them all. Instead, they were forced to set gross targets for the outputs of different industries. For some industries, like gas or electric power, this was not a problem. Electricity and gas are undifferentiated. A kilowatt is a kilowatt, no argument. But when you turn to consumer goods, clothes for example, the range of products was too big and targets were set in terms of monetary output. The plan would specify a growth in the value of output clothing, furniture, etc. What this translated to then depended on the price structure. By resulting to monetary targets, the socialist economies were already conceding part of Mises's argument. They were resorting to the monetary calculation that he had declared to be vital to any economic rationality, but empirical evidence for the greater macroeconomic efficiency of markets, even when compared to classical Soviet planning, is on much thinner ground."
This is a guy, by the way, who is a professor in Glasgow University, and that should really tell you something. To illustrate just how economically illiterate he is, this quote I'm about to give to you from, again, Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov, the two Soviet Union economists. He tried to claim that this quote here has got nothing to do with the economic calculation problem, when it actually has. So here's a quote by Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov, two Soviet Union economists, illustrating the example of the economic calculation problem. "To make 1 ton of copper, we use about 1,000 kilowatt hours of electrical energy, as against 300 in West Germany. To produce 1 ton of cement, we use twice the amount of energy that Japan does." That's why you never take someone as economically illiterate as him seriously, especially when he turns to an economic illiterate like that of, William Paul Cockshott. The very sad thing is, he was a professor in that of Glasgow University, which is an embarrassment to say the least, and it illustrates the very reason why I voted no to protect Scotland in the British Union.
As Allen, 2003, shows, the only capitalist economy whose long-term growth rate exceeded that of the USSR was Japan, whose own model was some way from unplanned capitalism. Compared to other countries starting out at the same economic level in the 1920s, the USSR grew considerably faster.
And that's a lie, folk, because from about the 1950s right up to the early 1990s, Japan turned towards more of a strongly free market type economy. So that's the very reason why Japan was very innovative. It's the very reason why it was very productive in so many regards. It's because of the market, not because of their socialism.
It's not all doom and gloom for historic planning, though. In the early 90s, Morrell, not a socialist by any regard, published an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives reviewing empirical studies of efficiency in the socialist planned economies. The results? Virtually all of them found that by standard neoclassical measures of efficiency, the planned economies performed as well or better than market economies.
And I would love to see where he gets this data from, because these planned economies were disastrous failures. You couldn't point to a single planned economy where you could say that it was economic success. Is he basing that off the fact that there was a high GDP? Because that doesn't necessarily mean to say that you're producing anything of value. When we speak about being productive in the sense of the efficient sense, it means being productive as in providing for consumers' needs and wants. It doesn't mean, mass producing something, putting it out there on the shelves and it's left there to rot in the warehouses, like the Soviet Union was rancid with. And like I gave you the example of just like the electrical energy being overused. Of course, the Soviet Union was very, very wasteful. Now, if he's honestly trying to tell you that those centrally planned economies were much greater than that of the non-centrally planned economies, he's having a laugh. Especially when you compare economies of similar size. Compare the United States of America, for example, to that of the Soviet Union. Or compare the United States of America to that of China. Isn't it funny how as soon as Deng Xiaoping stepped in 1977 and China began moving on the question of scale further towards capitalism, that the economy boomed? Of course, they like to have you believe that economic central planning was so wonderful. Well, if that's the case, then how come they've been given a shown up by the likes of Hong Kong, who had practically no natural resources, couldn't trade through the border of China, and yet was a tiny small fishing village that went on to become the richest city in the world off the back of that? Meanwhile, socialist economies like India used up about 70% of its natural resources in 5 decades because of socialism. And yet, despite using up 70% of their natural resources, they were still living in extreme poverty. The evidence is so stark against economic central planning, it's laughable. You saw the economic central planning of Venezuela through the price fixing, which resulted in the food shortage problem. And by the way, that took place during the oil boom.
Of the 18 studies he reviewed concerning technical efficiency of firms and standardizing their methodologies, he got the following results. A 90% level of technical efficiency in capitalist firms, a level of 93% in Soviet firms, in another 84% versus 86%, in another 87% versus 95%, and so on, practically identical. Furthermore, to the disappointment of those that decry the supposed soft budget constraints of socialist economies, meaning since the socialist state had an interest in having firms succeed, those same firms have technically no hard budget limit, and somehow this leads to inefficiencies. The reality is that socialist economies had a pretty high level of allocative efficiency, which is the degree to which inputs are allocated among firms in a way that maximizes the total output. His research found that, even at 100% allocative efficiency of inputs, Soviet outputs would grow only by a meager 2%. Hilariously, in my research for this video, I found strange justifications for these sort of results from the pro-market side. Basically, oh yeah, Soviet planned economy was as efficient, if not more efficient at allocating resources, but that's because they didn't have technological innovation. Only the market can do that.
He hasn't actually provided an argument there to say why the likes of these planned economies were efficient. He hasn't provided any argument at all. And it's not just a case of just looking at outputs. And when you're producing for individual consumers. Now, not all consumers are the same. He just thinks it's just a case of just taking something and producing it and that's it. As if all consumers just get the same. You could see that plastered all over the shelves of the Soviet Union. You noticed how all the products were exactly the same because the Soviet Union didn't have the information in order to know the vast information of consumers' needs and wants. It could only simplify things, and even then such basic goods were left in shortage and there was misallocation. But I don't know where he's going. He hasn't provided any argument there whatsoever.
Another mistakenly held belief is that prices within planned economies were arbitrarily set exchange ratios without any relation to the relative scarcities or economic values of inputs. The idea being that only the market can set prices close to equilibrium levels. This, too, is complete nonsense. Erich Dietzenbacher and Hans-Jürgen Wagner studied the phenomenon in comparing East and West German data, and found that the divergence from so-called optimal neoclassical prices to be identical between the two countries, 16.1% and 16.5%. Simply, the USSR and other planned socialist countries, despite having flawed systems of planning that nonetheless relied on a form of price signaling, still performed fairly well. That's not to say that their system of planning should be repeated, but it can be taken as an example to be studied and learned from.
The Soviet Union was absolutely rife with the surplus waste problems and the shortage problems, etc. It was rife with the economic calculation problem. This is arguably the worst example you could give.
Furthermore, history has shown that planned economies, even with their historical shortcomings, prove Mises and Hayek's criticisms to be generally unfounded.
If that was the case and things were so unfounded of what Ludwig von Mises had argued, then explain this quote. A turning point in Yeltsin's intellectual development occurred during his first visit to the United States in September 1989, more specifically his first visit to an American supermarket in Houston, Texas. The sight of aisle after aisle of shelves nearly stacked with every conceivable type of foodstuff and household item, each in a dozen varieties, both amazed and depressed him. For Yeltsin, like many other first-time Russian visitors to America, this was infinitely more impressive than tourist attractions like the Statue of Liberty and the Lincoln Memorial. It was impressive precisely because of its ordinariness, a cornucopy of consumer goods beyond the imagination of most Soviets was within the reach of ordinary citizens without standing in line for hours, and it was also attractively displayed for someone brought up in the drab conditions of communism, even a member of the relatively privileged elite. A visit to a Western supermarket involved a full-scale assault on the senses. Let me guess, it's just propaganda. No, it's not propaganda. It was economic reality. The reason why they were so amazed by the supermarket and that of the United States of America is because they had never seen anything like it in their life, which illustrates that the history of the Soviet Union was drab.
Chapter 5. The Future of Planning in Light of the Past. The fundamental assumptions behind the ECP is what is mistaken. What do markets do under capitalism? They are mechanisms for capital to reproduce itself. This behavior is rational in that it has a rationale, but it doesn't make it desirable for social ends. The point of socialist economics isn't to replicate this, but to break the rule of capital altogether. The point isn't to beat the market at its own game, but to simply create a truly rational mechanism for the production and distribution of goods.
You've not got the information of consumer demand, you've not got the information of prices, then you've not got the information in order to rationally calculate production. You don't know how much you're producing, you don't even know what resources you're going to use, and you don't even know where you're going to allocate them. You most certainly don't know the information of consumers' needs and wants. You don't even understand the economic calculation problem.
Now that's all well and good for historic planning, but socialist planning in the future should look different, right? Well, you're exactly right. The core of Mises' argument is that prices and costs are the best way to compare between alternative forms of making things, and to arrive at that which is most efficient. Mises seems to miss the possibility of a socialist economy setting internal prices, not as an expression of market value, but as an expression of alternative options in order to move resources between enterprises.
If you're not going to allow consumers to determine what prices are, then you don't hold the information of consumers' needs and wants. That's the point that you miss out. This is the part that you don't understand relative to prices. The reason why you see price fluctuation is because it's consumer demand that's dictating, and consumer demand isn't fixed. You have time preference. The market knows at what given time to allocate what given resources because they can see through the price fluctuation, but you're arguing to get rid of price fluctuation. What you're arguing for is something to do with internal prices. Let's just suppose we go along with your argument of internal prices. You're first of all going to be faced with the problem where you're going to try and get rid of the private sector, and I imagine you want to pay people wages, so therefore you're going to be left running the printing press. You're going to drive the country into hyperinflation. That's not debatable. That's a simple fact. That's what you get for running the printing press. If you're not going to have a private sector and you're going to be left running the printing press, you're going to be faced with a serious inflationary problem. That means that as a reaction to the inflationary problem, you're going to start setting down price ceilings, which is going to create price shortage problems. It's just a case of history repeating itself. Because let's just face it, you're stupid. Imagine thinking that you can somehow rationally set prices internally and just reject the fact that the consumers are the ones driving prices. So let's go along with your argument then. What if the consumer doesn't agree with your price? Have you ever thought of that? Of course not. And of course you're going to have to work out prices for each and every single product. Again, centrally planning prices. It's just a case where you don't live in the real world. And you obviously have no clue why that's not going to fix the economic calculation problem. In fact, what you're doing through price fixing, that is creating the economic calculation problem. Because the economic calculation problem is the absence of market-driven prices, the absence of profits and losses determined by the consumer. To reject the market-driven prices is to reject the consumer.
With enough data and enough math, you can calculate your way to efficient prices. But even that is unnecessary. The modern argument, which has its roots as early as the 1930s, is to use labor time as an alternative to prices.
But that means absolutely nothing in the face of the real world, because as soon as you produce something and put it out there on the shelves, you've no guarantee that it's going to sell. And each and every single individual consumer all have their own value for each and every single individual product, which is why your type live away in planet Zorb somewhere.
Furthermore, with modern computing, it wouldn't be too difficult to maintain up-to-date figures for the labor costs of each input to the production process. But labor values have limitations. Yes, but so do prices. Any scalar measure will have limitations as production is a multifactorial process. As previously mentioned, this issue has been solved nearly a century ago at this point. Kantorovich developed a form of in-kind calculation, meaning a non-monetary form of meeting the general constraints of production on top of labor time. No need for prices, and efficient too.
Without the information of profits and losses, there is no price information signals, there is no information of consumers' needs and wants, because essentially that's what you're gathering through prices.
It was never applied in the USSR due to the limitations of technology at the time, but by the 1990s, the story changed. What this means is that, since the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR, all of the criticisms of Mises and Hayek and co. have more or less no place anymore in the discussion. The exact details of modern planning is outside the scope of this video, but do take a look at Cockshott's excellent Towards a New Socialism, in which he lays out a lot of the how and why, with empirical evidence.
An economic degenerate towards a new socialism, that's right, towards a new socialism. Why not just socialism? Oh, that's right, because socialism didn't work. So he has to try and create a new socialism. Basically, you want to know what that language is? It's basically saying, let's bastardize the entire meaning of socialism and try and correlate the market to do with socialism. And as the definition of a market economy says, it's defining capitalism. So that's everything in a nutshell, folk. I don't really need to go into chapter 6 of what he's going on about because it's just repeating himself, really. The bottom line is, he doesn't understand the economic calculation problem. He doesn't understand why you need consumers driving what prices are. That's the only way that you could ever gather such information. He seems to think that, super computer technology can somehow read people's minds, etc. I've gone through all that. I don't need to go into it any further. So again, folk, if you've got anything you would like to ask, comment in the comment section below. And of course, I greatly appreciate it. Like the video, share the video, and of course, I'll get back to you in any of your comments. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.